My name is Paul Sparrow. I'm the director here at the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library Museum, and we are really pleased to have you here today for what I think is a very important program. This is the Henry Wallace Center here at the FDR Library, and it was created specifically to do programs like this, to give us a space in which we can engage the community, talk about relevant issues. One of the challenges we have in this modern era is that we are both a federally financed agency, part of the National Archives, but almost all of the programs we do, the exhibits, everything else is privately funded. So we are, the Presidential Library Systems is part of a public-private partnership. And so programs like this where we have a partner who comes in and brings in people, this is great for us as a way of showing the community our value and of engaging people in conversations that we think are vitally important. Now, as I told the panelists earlier, the only rule we have here is you can't say anything bad about Franklin Roosevelt. But today's conversation may push the edges of that rule a little bit. One of the things that I believed is that what makes this Presidential Library special is that we try to be as honest about all of the situations in the Roosevelt administration that we can. 2 years ago, we had a major exhibit on the Japanese internment for the anniversary of Executive Order 9066, in which we really tried to tell that story in an honest way. It was one of the great blights on the record of the Roosevelt administration. There are other controversial issues surrounding their decisions, and I try to say that understanding how great a president he was has to include discussion about the areas in which he failed to live up to his full potential, and in areas in which both he and Eleanor Roosevelt strongly disagreed. Housing and civil rights were obviously an area that they strongly disagreed. And there was Eleanor was the conscience of the administration. She was the voice for moral certitude, and FDR was a practicing politician. You know, he wanted to make things happen. He was a pragmatist, and he was faced with an American society that was fundamentally racist, anti-Semitic, and xenophobic. And many of the policies that he tried to get passed to help overcome the greatest economic catastrophe in American history ended up leaving some people out, and we're still living with those ramifications today. I hope that this conversation helps open a door and a window into what those decisions were and how they've impacted us today. I think this is a conversation that's very vitally important to our nonprofit partner, the Roosevelt Institute. For those of you who aren't familiar with them, they're our 501c3 partner. They're the ones who help raise money to support the library. But they also have a think tank, which is very involved with new progressive economic policies, specifically the New Deal and rewriting the rules for the 21st century. And they also have a student program called the Campus Network, which had brought together about 10,000 students all across the country at campuses to try to train the next generation of progressive leaders and getting them involved in their community issues to sort of become politically active while they're in college. And although it started out at some very elite universities, it has really spread now to community colleges and state universities all across the country. And so that agenda that the Roosevelt Institute has, our nonprofit partner, I think aligns very closely with the work that's going to be discussed today. So before we waste any more time with the introduction, please let me introduce our host for the day, Kevin O'Connor. Kevin, please come on up.
So I'd like to also add my welcome to historic Hyde Park, which is my hometown, and it's where I grew up. Ironically, one of my earliest memories occurred in November of 1962 when Eleanor Roosevelt passed away, and I think we had 4 presidents come, amongst other dignitaries, Truman and Eisenhower. President Kennedy and then Vice President Johnson were here. And the memory I have of that day, I was a month short of being 5 years old, was the motorcade went by our house. We lived over on 9G. And in the back right window, the window open, there was Jackie Kennedy waving at me. And I have a crystal memory of that. And so you can imagine the shock and horror a year later when just short of 6 years old, the president was assassinated. So a part of history, and we are certainly here today to talk about history. I want to thank our sponsors that have made this event possible. The National Equity Fund, LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation, NeighborWorks America, TD Bank, M&T Bank, Dutton Architecture, and Sneeringer Monahan Title Company. I want to thank the library and both Clifford Laub and Paul Sparrow for their immediate support with our idea about a year ago when we asked if we could bring this program here to the library. I'd like to thank Tara Collins, the Director of Communications for RUPCO, and Maru Gonzalez, my assistant, for all the details and putting this together. I'd especially like to call out and thank Guy Kemp, Vice President for Community Development, for his role in putting this event together today with us. I'm thrilled that two of our national partners are here today. They're not just sponsoring the event, and that is the Local Initiative Support Corporation and NeighborWorks America, both of whom were very supportive of us doing this early on. And I'm thrilled, too, that Enterprise Community Partners is here, and will be joining the panel later. And I have had a long relationship with Enterprise as well, and thrilled that they're here. And they represent three of the largest national nonprofits involved in housing and community development. Following Richard's talk this afternoon, we're going to have a panel, and it's a fantastic panel. Maurice Jones, the CEO and president of LISC, will be here. Maurice was our keynote speaker 2 years ago at Community Lunch, and I've heard Maurice speak a number of times. Lorraine Collins, who I got to know through her work at New York State Homes and Community Renewal for many years, and Lorraine is now the Director of Public Policy and External Affairs at Enterprise. She'll be on the panel. KT Tobin is a friend and a co-parent from New Paltz. I think my son James just arrived, and James and Miles are good buddies. And KT is the Associate Director of the Benjamin Center at SUNY New Paltz for public policy initiatives at the center. And Rutledge Simmons, one of my, I think, more recent acquaintance and friends. Rutledge is the Executive Vice President and General Counsel and Secretary at NeighborWorks America, where he's also taken up the mantle of leading the READY program for NeighborWorks America. READY stands for Race, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and it's a program that NeighborWorks has championed and to bring this conversation to groups all across the country. This is our 38th year at RUPCO. Our mission is to create homes, support people, and improve communities. Our vision is for strong, vibrant, and diverse communities with a home and opportunity for everyone. I think a number of my board members are in the room today, but I especially would like to recognize the board chair, Chris Marks. Chris is here. He's the Dean of Continuing and Professional Education at SUNY Ulster. Thank you. He certainly deserves a round of applause. So for the last couple of years at NeighborWorks America, through the READY program, RUPCO has been engaged in this conversation, and I'd like to recognize some of the team members from the READY program who are here today, I hope. Jake Michaels, Jess Gutierrez, Marie Pickle, and Lisa McDonald, along with Guy Kemp and myself, have been participants in the READY team for the last couple of years. It was a little over a year ago that on an NPR podcast, after coming back from a READY program where we were deeply involved in talking about race and the construct that started over 400 years ago here on this continent and through the history of racial discrimination and white supremacy that has occurred in this country, I heard Richard Rothstein on a podcast, and he was talking about and zeroing in on housing and in particular the federal government's role in racial discrimination in housing. And so I got his book, and I read his book, and I was stunned by his book. And for weeks, I walked around, I was in a conundrum. I was like, wait a second. I've been in housing for 30 years, directed level at two prominent nonprofits here in the Valley, Hudson River Housing and now at RUPCO. I think I knew all of this. No, wait a second. I should know all this. I didn't know all of this. Why didn't I know more of this? And so literally a year ago tomorrow, on May 1st, I sent Richard a note at 2 o'clock in the afternoon asking him if he would be interested in coming to the FDR Library to talk to people that are in the housing realm. And at 10 o'clock that night, Richard wrote back and said that he would. I just reread the book this past weekend, and I urge you to get a copy if you haven't had a chance to read it. It details the history of de jure racial discrimination in housing by the federal government. I'd like to sort of finish with 3 ideas. One is that we know that discrimination in the federal government started before President Roosevelt, and it certainly continued long after him. Second, that it involved a whole cast of people, players and actors to carry out. So in came the realtors, the assessors, insurance companies, appraisers, the banks, the nonprofits, churches, synagogues, the federal agencies, the regulators, state and local officials, the police, and the unions all played a role in carrying it out. Thirdly, that there's a challenge. You know, the subtitle of Richard's book is The Forgotten History of How Government Segregated Us. And whether we never knew, or we forgot, or we avoided this history, the challenge now is to learn it, to teach it, to expose it, to grapple with it, and to seek to remedy it. So we start with ourselves at RUPCO, where we, as a nonprofit, administer several federal and state programs. And I challenge us to make sure that we're looking at the ways that we do it and ways that are we creating or contributing still today to segregation, or are there ways that we can and are contributing ways towards remedy? I challenge the library, the FDR Library here today, to do a better job of telling this part of the story and the legacy of the New Deal. It was just a year ago that I was here at an event held by M&T, and there was an exhibition on the Japanese internment. Another chapter, not the best foot forward by President Roosevelt, but they told that story, and I would ask that they seek to do a better job of telling this story. I challenge each of you. Most of you are here today because of the role you play in housing. I challenge you to unforget this forgotten history of how government segregated us, and to join this conversation in the hard work towards remedy. So with that, it gives me, it's my honor to introduce Richard Rothstein. Richard doesn't like to brag about his past, but currently he is a Distinguished Fellow of Economic Policy Institute, an Emeritus Senior Fellow of the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, a Senior Fellow at the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. Richard is the author of 2 other books in education, Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right, and Class in Schools, Using Social, Economic, and Educational Reform to Close the Black-White Achievement Gap. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the author of The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein.
Thank you very much, Kevin. You know, when you're an old retired guy, you accumulate a lot of useless titles, and he couldn't resist, but they are useless. Thank you for that introduction. And Mr. Sparrow, if you're still here, thank you for making this possible. I appreciate your comments about the ambiguity of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency when it comes to some of these issues, and I'm going to address some of that because we're here today in this important place. But let me first begin by reminding all of you about something that you well know, and that is that in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. Civil rights lawyers began in the 1930s by challenging segregation in law schools, because they figured that if judges were too dense to understand anything else, they might be able to figure out that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated law school. And then they won that case and went on to use that precedent to abolish segregation in colleges and universities. And then, as you all know, that laid the foundation for a 1954 victory in the Brown versus Board of Education decision that abolished legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And the Brown decision inspired activists across the country. We had a beginning civil rights movement, but this really gave it a big boost. And over the next 15 years, the civil rights movement engaged not just in litigation, not just in legislative activity, but in marches and in demonstrations and in civil disobedience. And people lost their lives in that struggle. And by the end of the 1960s, we'd abolished segregation in everything from lunch counters. You know the story of the Greensboro sit-ins and buses. You all know about Rosa Parks. Swimming pools, water fountains, public accommodations of all kinds, interstate transportation. We came to understand, all of us, the country as a whole, mostly, that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, and that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society. How can we justify segregation, we said to ourselves. And then at the end of the 1960s, having won all these victories in all these various areas of public life, the civil rights movement folded up its tent, went home, left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. I'm sure some of you have lived in at least a few. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were either white or all mostly white, or all black, or mostly all black, mostly black. How could it be? How could it be that, having come to understand that racial segregation was wrong, harmful to both blacks and whites, immoral, incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society, how could it be that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? And in one sense, it's probably easy to understand, only in one sense, and that is that racial segregation in neighborhoods is a lot harder to undo than segregation in water fountains or buses or swimming pools. If we abolish segregation in lunch counters, the next day you can go to any restaurant you want and be served. If we abolish segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. It's a lot harder to undo once we've established this segregation. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, myself included, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, African Americans, whites, Southerners, Northerners, what we've done is we've adopted a national rationalization, a myth, that we tell ourselves that excuses us. It's an excuse we give ourselves to avoid confronting, as I say, the biggest segregation of all, to avoid living up to our responsibilities as citizens in a democratic society. And that excuse goes something like this. Oh, the segregation that occurred in law schools or colleges or schools or interstate transportation or public accommodations, we tell ourselves, that was all done by government. That was the result of laws, of ordinances, of regulations, of public policies of various kinds. They were civil rights violations. If the federal government was doing it, it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment's protection of due process. If it was a state and local government that was doing it, it was a violation of the 14th Amendment, which applied similar principles to state and local governments. They were civil rights violations, violations of the Constitution, and as such, we had an obligation to remedy them. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, and I mean all of us, I include myself before I did this research, so I'm not putting anything on you that I don't put on myself. Residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that's entirely different. That wasn't done by government. That all happened because, bigoted homeowners in white neighborhoods wouldn't sell homes to black families. Or maybe actors in the private economy, not governmental institutions, banks or real estate agents, discriminated in how they issued mortgages or what homes they would show to families based on their race. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's because, blacks and whites just like to live with each other of the same race. They feel more comfortable in same race neighborhoods. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's because of income differences. On average, not everyone, but on average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, and therefore they just can't afford to move to middle-class neighborhoods, and that's why we have segregation. All of these individual, personal, bigoted perhaps, but non-governmental decisions is what's created residential segregation, and we tell ourselves that what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. It's not a civil rights violation if this is the result of private activity. And if it's not a civil rights violation, we have no obligation to do anything about it. We'd like to do something about it, of course. We think residential segregation is too bad, but we don't feel an obligation to do anything about it. It's not that the civil rights movement tried to desegregate neighborhoods and failed. It barely tried. Well, we give a name to this myth that we've adopted. It's a term we all use, as I say, all of us, blacks, whites, liberals, conservatives, etc. The name we give it is de facto segregation. And the Supreme Court has embraced this view. I mean, we all use this term, de facto segregation, and it's ratified our instinct that de facto segregation is not remediable by public policy. It's not a civil rights violation, it just sort of happened. Well, I spent much of my time, Kevin alluded to this, prior to engaging in the research that led to this book, as an education policy writer. I was, for a while, the education columnist at the New York Times. I worked as an education policy analyst for the research institution that Kevin mentioned, the Economic Policy Institute. And I came in the 1990s and 2000s to understand that the national education policy that we were following was wrongheaded, made no sense to me. You may recall this, the national education policy that we were following in the 1990s and 2000s was concerned about the achievement gap between black and white students in particular, low-income students and middle-class students, the fact that black students, lower-income students had lower average achievement than whites, middle-class whites. And the country decided that the reason for this achievement gap was that teachers in schools didn't try hard enough with minority children. They had low expectations. And the solution to the achievement gap was to hold teachers in schools accountable for the achievement of their students. Test the students more often and hold schools and teachers accountable for the results. And the view was that if we did that, in a very few years, the achievement gap would disappear. As you all know, we passed a law embracing that view. It was called the No Child Left Behind Law. It was sponsored by President Bush, a Republican, in the Senate by the most liberal Democrat in the Senate, Ted Kennedy, in the House by the most liberal Democrat in the House, George Miller. This was a bipartisan conviction, and I thought it was utter nonsense. And I wrote column after column and article after article about it, and I tried to explain that the reason that we have the achievement gap is not because of the low expectations of teachers, but because children of different social classes come to school with different degrees of disadvantage, social and economic disadvantage, that makes it impossible for schools to get the same achievement out of all children regardless of their social class background. And so, for example, I remember writing one column in the Times about asthma. Black children in urban neighborhoods have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children in this country. 4 times the rate. They have asthma because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more deteriorated buildings, more vermin in the environment. And when the child has asthma, the child is possibly more often up at night wheezing, comes to school drowsy the next day, maybe sleepless, maybe even absent from school. And I tried to explain if you had two groups of children who are equal in every respect, identical groups of children, same racial breakdown, same social and economic background, same family structure, same income level, everything you can imagine, two identical groups of children, except that one group had a higher rate of asthma. That group was inevitably going to have lower average achievement. It's not that some children with asthma won't have higher achievement than typical children without asthma, because there's a distribution of outcomes for every human characteristic. But inevitably, if a child comes to school drowsy, that child is more likely to do poorly in school than a child who comes to school well rested. That's just, to me, seemed common sense. How could you have a law that says that if a teacher has high expectations, drowsiness won't matter? And I went through column after column explaining the different pathways by which social and economic disadvantages lower achievement, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or stress from economic insecurity. You can go through the same exercise, two groups of children identical in every respect, except one group has a greater degree of this disadvantage. And by doing that, you explain a good part of the achievement gap. And then I began to think, and it took me a while, I'm a slow learner, I gradually began to realize that what happens when you have a school where every child has either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or stress from economic insecurity? How can you have a law that expects that school to have the same achievement as a school where children come to school well rested and not poisoned by lead and in secure homes and stable economic circumstances? Well, we call those schools where we concentrate children with these disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And schools today are more segregated than they have been at any time in the last 45 years. And they're more segregated than they have been at any time in the last 45 years because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So it gradually dawned on me that housing policy must be education policy. And I began to think about this, and this was the early 2000s. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court case that evaluated a very trivial attempt by two school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington, that were trying to desegregate their schools in a very minor way. They were concerned about the issues I was just talking about, but both of them adopted a plan, a choice plan, where parents in the district could choose which school their child would attend. But if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, that choice would not be honored in favor of the choice of a child who would help to diminish segregation. It was a trivial plan. If you had a school that was all white or mostly white, and you had one place left in the school and both a black and a white child applied for that last place, the black child would be given some preference because that child would help to desegregate the school. I mean, how often does it happen? You have one place left in the school and you have to choose between two opposite races. You couldn't imagine a more trivial plan, but the Supreme Court denounced it, said it was unconstitutional, so you couldn't do a thing like this. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the controlling opinion in the case, and he explained that the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated. It's true, but he said they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. I thought that was a pretty wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. That's, in fact, why the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. And they went on to explain that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle are segregated de facto for all the reasons I just described: private bigotry and actors in the private economy and personal choice and income differences and so on. He went through all of them. The government was not responsible for it, and if the government wasn't responsible for it, it would be unconstitutional for the school districts of Louisville and Seattle to take any action to offset it. Well, I read this decision, and I remembered reading about a case some years before in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the districts that was the subject of this decision. And in Louisville, Kentucky, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home in an all-white single-family suburb of Louisville called Shively. He had an African-American friend who was living in the center city of Louisville in a rented apartment. The friend was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a middle-class job, a decent income, a wife and a daughter. He wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this suburb of Shively bought another home in his suburb and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home of white residents of the community. They were protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. Somehow the police could not identify a single perpetrator. They dynamited and firebombed the home. Police couldn't identify a single perpetrator. Nobody was convicted of any violation in that riot. But when the riot was all over, the white homeowner who had sold the home to the African American was arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence for sedition for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, if the courts and the criminal justice system and the police and the prosecutors are all engaged in an effort to maintain racial boundaries in Louisville, this doesn't sound much to me like de facto segregation. And maybe there's something that I need to learn more about this, and maybe Chief Justice Roberts needs to learn as well about the history of Louisville. And so I began to look into it, and the first thing I discovered as I looked into this, and I'm not exaggerating, I use these words very carefully, there were thousands of cases of police-protected violence against African Americans who had legitimately purchased homes in white neighborhoods, driving them out of those neighborhoods in the 20th century. Every one of them where the police were involved or the courts were involved, was a civil rights violation, requiring a remedy that has never been implemented. And then as I looked further into it, I discovered that it was not only the use of the police, prosecutors, and courts in violation of the 14th Amendment to establish racial and maintain racial boundaries, but it was many policies of the federal, state, and local governments, all of which created a system of public policy that was effective in creating the segregation that we know today. The policies at all levels of government interacted, reinforced each other, and created segregation. There is nothing de facto about it. De facto segregation is an utter myth. It's one, as I said, that we've adopted to give ourselves an excuse for not doing anything about it, to allow ourselves to claim to be a democratic society without justification. Well, let me spend a few minutes this afternoon describing some of the major federal policies that the federal government followed to create, enforce, sustain, and perpetuate racial segregation, policies that were so powerful that they still determine the racial boundaries that we know today. The first one I want to talk about is public housing, something I think that many of you may misunderstand, as I did. We think of poor public housing, as I'm sure you do, as a place where poor people live. Lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men without jobs in the formal economy, attracting the attention of the police, getting into confrontations with them, deteriorated buildings frequently, dirt rather than lawn around them. That's our image of public housing. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country in the New Deal, in the Roosevelt administration. The first civilian public housing in this country was built in the New Deal. It was not for poor people. Poor people were not allowed in public housing during the New Deal. It was for working class families, lower middle class families, primarily whites. It was not a welfare program. The people in public housing paid the full cost of the housing in their rent. They weren't subsidized. The purpose of public housing was to solve a housing crisis, not to support poor people. There was very little construction going on in the Depression. Many families, even though they were employed and could afford housing, couldn't find any. There was 25% unemployment in the Depression. It was a terrible time. But 75% was employed, and public housing was for the employed 75%. The Public Works Administration, the first New Deal agency, built the first civilian public housing in this country, and everywhere they built it, they segregated it. Frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed, segregating integrated neighborhoods. And that may surprise you. We don't think of urban areas as having many integrated neighborhoods early in the mid-20th century, but in fact, we'd be stunned if we were transported back to that period of time to see the extent of downtown integration that existed among working class families, for the simple reason that we were a manufacturing economy at that time. None of this internet stuff. Manufacturing economy, factories had to be located near either a deep water port or a railroad terminal in order to get their parts and ship their final products. So they were all concentrated in the same place. And if you had a factory district that was employing Irish workers and Italian workers and Jewish workers and African Americans, they all had to live in broadly the same neighborhoods. They didn't have cars to drive to work from different suburbs. They had to be able to walk to work. So there were many, many such integrated neighborhoods. Not everywhere was integrated, obviously, but there were many of these, especially for working class families in downtown areas. The Public Works Administration built public housing in many of these areas, and everywhere it built it, it segregated it, creating separate projects for African Americans and for whites, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. The first Public Works Administration project was built in Atlanta. Atlanta, a southern city, had segregated water fountains and buses and schools, but it had integrated housing for the same reason. You had to have, people had to be able to walk to work. In a neighborhood near downtown Atlanta called the Flats, a neighborhood that was about half black and half white, the Public Works Administration demolished housing and built a project for whites only, creating the first segregation of that neighborhood and forcing the African Americans who were displaced to double up with relatives or find less adequate housing elsewhere. Some of you may know, I hope, or have read the work of the great African American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes described in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. That's not how we think of downtown Cleveland today. But he said his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. This was his experience in early 20th century America. That neighborhood, the central neighborhood of Cleveland, was the location of Public Works Administration public housing. The PWA demolished housing and built a separate project for whites and a separate project for African Americans, creating segregation in that community, which hadn't previously existed, and with other projects elsewhere in Cleveland, created the segregation patterns of Cleveland, reinforced them, that we know today. In my book, some of you may have read it, you know that I like where I can to pick on smug, self-satisfied places, places that think they're better than the rest of us. Cambridge, Massachusetts, for example. In Cambridge, the area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. Again, about half black and half white, 60-40. The Public Works Administration demolished housing there to build two separate projects, one for blacks and one for whites, creating a pattern of segregation there that hadn't previously existed. And as I say, this was done anywhere the Public Works Administration operated, creating segregation always. During World War II, the federal government intensified its efforts to segregate the country. Hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production during the war to take jobs that hadn't previously existed in war plants. They overwhelmed the communities where these war plants were located. The communities couldn't house all of them who came. The ramp up of production of war material was so fast and rapid, there was no housing available for the workers. And the federal government, if it wanted the tanks and the jeeps and the airplanes and the ships to be produced, had to somehow find a way to house these war workers, and it did. Everywhere the federal government created war worker housing, it created it on a segregated basis. These were workers in the same war plants, created housing on a segregated basis. In many cases, creating segregation in communities that had never known segregation of any kind before, because there had been so few African Americans in those neighborhoods. The West Coast is a good example of that. The historians divide up the great migration of African Americans out of the South into the rest of the country into two big periods. The first great migration took place during World War I, and that was the migration that brought many black families to this area, to Detroit, to Chicago, to Pittsburgh, to the Midwest industrial area. The second great migration during World War II was the first opportunity for African Americans in any substantial numbers to come to the West Coast. So there were very few African Americans living there. In the suburb of Berkeley, another one of those smug, self-satisfied areas, the shipyards were built. The suburb was called Richmond. Richmond became the biggest shipbuilding center on the West Coast to build ships for the war effort. No shipyards there before the war. By the end of the war, there were 100,000 workers in these shipyards. Richmond was a tiny suburb of Berkeley, 20,000, all white. Very few. There were a couple of African Americans living in the outskirts, working as domestics in white family homes, but there was no previous pattern of segregation within Richmond. There were no blacks living there. But the federal government created segregation there by building temporary, shoddy housing for the black workers in their families along the railroad tracks and in the industrial area of Richmond, and for white workers, more stable housing in the residential areas. The city of Richmond explained that it wasn't necessary to build stable housing for the black workers, excuse me, it wasn't necessary to build stable housing for the black workers, because black workers who came to Richmond during the war would have to leave at the end of the war. But that was not the case for the white workers who came. And again, this was done throughout the country. In San Francisco, there were 5 projects, housing projects built for war workers during World War II, 4 of them for whites only. 1 was for African Americans. Mr. Sparrow referred before to the removal of Japanese Americans to internment camps during the war. The location of the Black Project for war workers was in the area which had been heavily populated by Japanese Americans, so there were lots of vacancies there. Some black workers were able to find housing, so the government decided that was going to be the black ghetto of San Francisco, and that's where it placed the housing for black war workers. Again, these were people working in the same war plants. And in Portland, and in Seattle, and in Los Angeles, up and down the West Coast. This is how segregation was created for the first time, not building on any previous pattern because there were so few African Americans living there during the war. After the war, we still had an enormous housing crisis. In fact, it was even greater. Not only had there been no housing built during the Depression, except for these public projects that I talked about, there was very little construction activity that went on. And during World War II, it was actually forbidden to use construction materials for civilian purposes unless it was for housing war workers. And then millions of returning war veterans were coming home after the war, needing housing, a housing crisis, much like we have today. We had returning war veterans living in Quonset huts and in fields, doubled, tripled up with relatives. President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt, had to address this housing crisis. And so he proposed a vast expansion of the National Public Housing Program. Conservatives in Congress, and remember he was proposing it for returning war veterans, let me say this, people who had jobs in the post-war economy. We were still not subsidizing public housing. It hadn't become a welfare program yet. These are for working families for whom no housing, other housing was available. Conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat Truman's 1949 Housing Act. They wanted to defeat it not for racial reasons. It was always segregated. They didn't object to that. And it wasn't because they didn't like poor people. Poor people weren't allowed in public housing for the most part. They wanted to defeat it because they thought that public housing was socialistic. The government shouldn't be involved in the housing market. That should be left to the private sector. Not that the private sector was building any housing for returning war veterans. The private sector was focused, to the extent it was building housing on the affluent. But that was their rationalization. So they came up with a strategy in Congress, which we refer to as a poison pill strategy. This was not the only time it's been used, but a poison pill strategy is a strategy whereby opponents of a bill put forward an amendment to the bill, propose an amendment to the bill, we call it a poison pill amendment, that they think can get passed. They think can mobilize a majority. And then when the amendment is passed and attached to the bill and the full bill comes up on the floor of the House and the Senate with this amendment attached, the entire bill becomes unpalatable to a different majority and the entire bill goes down to defeat. So that's why the amendment is called a poison pill. Conservatives in Congress proposed an amendment along the following lines. They said from now on, there can't be any more racial discrimination in public housing. No more segregated public housing. We have to have non-discriminatory public housing. They thought they would vote, they planned to vote for this amendment. They thought they could get some northern liberals to join with them to vote against discrimination in public housing. That would create a majority. And then when the full bill came up on the floor of the Senate, the conservatives would flip and vote against the final bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats who were opposed to integrated public housing, but all in favor of segregated public housing, and the entire bill will go down to defeat. So liberals faced a conundrum. What were they going to do? They had an enormous housing crisis that they wanted to address, just like we have today. Were they going to address this housing crisis by paying the price of agreeing that segregation would be maintained, reinforced, codified in public housing? Or were they going to vote for the integration amendment and guarantee that no housing would be built to address the housing crisis? I am not minimizing the difficulty of their choice. It was a very difficult choice. And I'm devoting some time to this story because it's the same choice we face in our housing policies today. Well, it was a tough choice. The liberals were led by their leading liberal in the Senate at that time was a senator from Illinois, Paul Douglas. He was joined by someone else who some of you may be more familiar with. He was called Mr. Civil Rights, the senator from Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey. They decided that they were going to vote and lead their colleagues to vote against the integration amendment in order to get the public housing that was needed to address the housing crisis. Senator Douglas got up on the floor of the Senate and made a speech along the following lines. He said, I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off if the non-discrimination amendment is defeated and you get the housing that you need than you will be if the integration amendment is passed and you get no housing at all. Well, in retrospect, I don't know that we've been better off with that devil's bargain that the liberals made in those days, but it's understandable. They did address the housing crisis. But the long-term price that we paid for that decision that Douglas and Humphrey and the other liberals made was the reinforcing of racial segregation in urban areas to an extent that had never before been known. The massive public housing projects that we know all over the country were constructed. The long-term consequences of that decision were not only the achievement gap in schools that I described before, but health disparities between African Americans and whites. Blacks have shorter life expectancy, greater rates of heart disease because they live in more polluted neighborhoods. The confrontations that we see between young men and police in places like Ferguson and Milwaukee and Baltimore and hundreds of places later in the 20th century could not exist if we weren't concentrating the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without access to good jobs or even the transportation to get them. I think another price that we pay for that decision that Paul Douglas and Hubert Humphrey made is the very dangerous political polarization that we have in this country today that largely, not entirely, but largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever develop the common national identity that's necessary if this democracy is going to be preserved? If so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to identify with each other's life experiences, to develop, as I say, this common national identity, to empathize with each other. So that's the price that we paid. As I said, we're still paying that today, and we're still reduplicating Douglas's choice. We have affordable housing projects today. Most of them, not all of them, but most of the affordable housing that we do today is placed in already low-income segregated neighborhoods for the same reason that Paul Douglas and Hubert Humphrey agreed to segregation. It's easier to do it there. There's no community opposition. There are no NIMBYs. You don't have to hold 100 community meetings if you want to explain why you're bringing black and brown people into somebody's neighborhood if you simply build most of your public housing in low-income segregated neighborhoods. It's an understandable choice. It's the only way we can address the house, or at least the easiest way to address the housing crisis that we face today. But it's no different from the choice that Douglas made. And we do make some exceptions. I know that RUPCO, for example, is trying its best to place some of its affordable housing projects that it supports in high opportunity neighborhoods. But overall, nationally, most of them are placed in low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing segregation and creating and reinforcing those crises of inequality that I just described in education and health and criminal justice in our democratic processes. Well, I'll come back to that later, but as I said, under the 1949 Housing Act, we had a vast expansion of public housing, and very soon after that, a development occurred that was quite surprising to housing experts, to policy experts, to people like the predecessors of many of you in this room. And that is, all of a sudden, it seemed, the white projects developed large numbers of vacancies. The black projects had long waiting lists. Pretty soon, we're talking now the early 1950s, pretty soon even the most bigoted public housing official couldn't justify a situation where some projects in his city were virtually empty and others had long waiting lists. So all the projects were opened up to African Americans, and pretty soon public housing became a predominantly African American institution. And then something else happened. Industry that I had mentioned before, that used to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals, moved away from the cities into rural areas that no longer needed to ship their parts and get their final products by rail or by boat. There were highways being built. They could do this by truck. So at the same time that we were concentrating African Americans in urban areas and whites were leaving, the jobs were leaving as well. The black families in public housing became poorer and poorer, as did the black families in the surrounding private market. Suddenly, the government had to subsidize the public housing. People could no longer afford to pay the full cost of housing and their rent. Once the government started to subsidize it, it stopped investing in it, it stopped maintaining it. The projects deteriorated, and we got the kind of urban slums that we associate with public housing today. But we should keep in mind that that's not how public housing began. It's not how it needs to be. Well, the question is, why did all these vacancies occur in the white projects and not in the African American ones? And that's primarily because of another federal program that was equally powerful, perhaps even more powerful, in creating segregation in this country than even the segregation of public housing. And that was a program by another New Deal agency, the Federal Housing Administration, that was explicitly designed on a racially explicit basis to segregate the country, to move all white working class families out of urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs. This was a racially explicit program. It was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was not the unintended consequence of a race-neutral policy. This was a racially explicit policy of the Federal Housing Administration to suburbanize the white population and leave the African American population behind. We were not a suburban country at that time. The suburbs were just being developed. The suburbs were a speculative venture. Nobody thought that people would really want to move to single-family homes in the suburbs when they could continue living in cities where their friends were, where their relatives were. Who would want to do a crazy thing like that? The biggest of these suburbs that were developed, you all know, in this state, it was Levittown, east of New York City. The construction there began in 1947. This was on all over the country, developments like this. well, maybe some of you remember hearing a song that Pete Seeger used to sing. Melvina Reynolds wrote it, about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. That was about a suburb just as large as Levittown, south of San Francisco. Los Angeles became the symbol of suburbanization in the country, and Federal Housing Administration projects there included places like Panorama City, a name perhaps you've heard of, or Lakewood, or Westchester, just west of the city. A developer like William Levitt in Levittown, as I say, this was a speculative venture. He wanted to build 17,000 homes in one place. He had no buyers for them. He tried to convince banks that, oh, you know, I can sell 17,000 homes out in Nassau County. Lots of people will want to move there. The banks thought he was crazy. They wouldn't lend him money. The only way that Levitt, or the builder of the little boxes in San Francisco, south of San Francisco, or the hundreds and hundreds of these suburbs and subdivisions in between, the only way they could get the funds to buy the land and build these projects was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, proposing their plans, which included the construction materials they were going to use, the design of the homes, the layout of the subdivision, and an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. And with that commitment, the Federal Housing Administration would insure their bank loans so that they could buy the land and build the projects. As I said, this was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was written out in a federal policy manual that the Federal Housing Administration issued to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of developers to build these subdivisions. The manual explicitly prohibited them from recommending for federal bank guarantees any suburb that would not be restricted to whites only. The manual even prohibited the federal guarantees for loans to build an all-white subdivision if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. Where did this de facto notion come from? It's utter nonsense. That's how the country was suburbanized. Levitt was able to get his bank loans with federal guarantees. The FHA added that he even had to place a clause in the deed of every home in the subdivision prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This is how the country came to be suburbanized. This is how we created a white noose around every metropolitan area of this country. It was an explicit program. It was a violation of the Constitution. It was a civil rights violation. It was something that we have to take an obligation to remedy. The consequences of this particular policy were enormous. And as I said, they still determine the racial boundaries that we have today. Those homes in the suburbs like Levittown or the one in south of San Francisco or any of these others in between were sold, as I say, to working class returning war veterans. They had jobs in the post-war economy. The African Americans didn't have as good jobs as the whites did, but they had jobs. They could afford to buy this very inexpensive housing that Levitt and these other developers were building. Levittown, for example, homes there, 750 square feet, modest 2-bedroom, 1-bath homes for working class families, sold to returning white war veterans for roughly $8,000, $9,000 at the time. In today's inflation-adjusted money, that's $100,000. It's twice national median income. Any working class family can afford to buy a home for twice national median income, especially if they're a veteran and no down payment is required. The white families who moved out of public housing could pay less in their monthly housing costs in these federally subsidized subdivisions than they were paying for rent in public housing. That's how enormous the subsidy was. Well, as you all know, those homes don't sell for $100,000 today. They've appreciated in value. They now sell for $200,000, $300,000, $400,000. That's not inflation. The $100,000 base is inflation adjusted to start with. The white families who are subsidized by the federal government to buy these homes gained over the next few generations thousands of dollars in wealth They use that from the equity that they appreciation in their homes. They use that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to finance their retirements, to take care of medical or temporary unemployment emergencies. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans who were prohibited by federal policy from participating in this wealth generating exercise gained no such wealth. They were required to continue living in rented apartments in urban areas. The result is that today, African American incomes, that is what they earn from their work, is about, on average, 60%, 60% of white incomes. There's a whole story about that disparity. I won't go into it today. You'll have to invite me back for a different lecture for that one. But let's just take it from me that there's a 60% income ratio between the races. You'd think that with a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. But the reality is that while there's a 60% income ratio, African Americans on average have about 10% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that has never been remedied. Entirely attributable to, and the wealth gap is the primary contributor to the enormous racial inequality that we have today. You can add that to the achievement gap and the health disparities and the mass incarceration and the threats to our democracy. It's the consequences of the residential segregation that we are ignoring and not taking serious steps to redress. Well, the policies to redress segregation are quite easy to understand. Housing experts know what they are. Many of you know what they are. It's not like it's rocket science to develop these policies. What's difficult is developing the political will, the new civil rights movement, that's necessary to force such policies to be considered and adopted, and that we have virtually nothing of today. So while I can talk about what the remedies would be, I think it's wrong to focus on designing policies at this point. What we need, as I say, is a mass mobilization, a new civil rights movement that's going to redress it. I'll mention a few things. I was talking earlier with some of you about this. For example, in my book, I suggest that in a place like Levittown, the federal government should be buying up homes at market rates and reselling them to qualified African Americans, not to poor people, but there are many working class, middle class African Americans who could afford to buy housings, reselling them at $100,000, the price that they should have been paid had they had their parents and grandparents been permitted to buy them. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy to a very specific constitutional violation. And no constitutional lawyer, and I've made this suggestion many times, has ever said that that's not correct. But of course, we're not about to do something like that unless public opinion forces that kind of change. At the low end, I alluded to this before, we have several policies to support the housing of low-income families. The low-income housing tax credit, with which many of you are engaged, is one of them. The Section 8 voucher program, the Housing Choice Voucher Program is another. Both of those, overall, with exceptions, and those exceptions are important, reinforce segregation today. The Treasury Department regulations for low-income housing tax credit actually place a priority in placing low-income developments in already low-income neighborhoods on the theory that that's the way to revitalize those neighborhoods. Not that it's really ever worked, but that's the theory. We should modify those regulations and state QAPs, the plans that states adopt to implement those regulations, should be modified in a way that place a priority on more low-income housing, not all of it, but more low-income housing in high-opportunity neighborhoods to attempt to redress their segregation. The Section 8 voucher program is similar. Most of them are used in already low-income segregated neighborhoods. We need to do a better job of ensuring that more of them are usable in high-opportunity communities. I just learned that at lunch today that the state of New York has just adopted a prohibition on source of income discrimination. That's a great step forward. Now it needs to be enforced. And of course, the rental subsidies have to be adjusted so that, and there's a way to do that, so that families can afford with Section 8 vouchers to move to high opportunity communities. Zoning laws need to be modified. In my view, zoning rules that limit a community to single-family homes on large lot sizes are unconstitutional because they perpetuate an unconstitutionally created racial segregation, and they should be challenged. And unless they are challenged, the recommendations I just made about placing more light-tech developments and more housing choice vouchers in high-opportunity communities will be an empty recommendation. Because if you can't build townhouses or even single-family homes on small lot sizes in many communities, there's no point recommending that we place more such housing in those communities. So the policies to do it are well known. Gentrification is a big issue. Let me conclude with that one. We know how to control gentrification so that it doesn't displace vast numbers of previous residents of existing communities. Gentrification would be a great thing. Every community should be gentrified. Every community should have a mix of moderate market rate and low-income housing. Every community should have that. What's happening with gentrification is communities are being flipped from low-income segregated neighborhoods to high-income segregated neighborhoods, white neighborhoods. It's happening all over the country. We know how to fix that. We should have rent control programs that prevent families from being displaced as they begin to compete with higher income renters. We should have limits on condominium conversions. We should have inclusionary zoning programs that require any development to have a share of its units in the private market, a share of its units affordable for low and moderate income families. We should freeze property taxes so that families pay property taxes at the valuation of their homes when they purchase them and are not forced out of their homes when the community improves and they can no longer afford to pay the property taxes on homes they've lived in for decades. So the policies there are well known as well. We also need to, of course, ensure that when some families are displaced, and you can't have stable gentrification of the kind I just described without some people being displaced, we have to ensure that the people who are displaced have the opportunity to go to high opportunity neighborhoods, not newly segregated communities where where they have been going as a result of gentrification. Well, I want to spend just a couple minutes at the end. May I? Okay. I want to address Mr. Sparrow's comments, if I may, about this being the FDR Library, because Franklin Roosevelt was the most, well, maybe not the most, but up until that point, the most progressive president that we've had. Most people are stunned by how it is that the Roosevelt administration, the New Deal, created these policies of segregation, because it was the New Deal that created them. They weren't building on previous policies. The federal government wasn't involved in housing before the Public Works Administration, before the FHA came on the scene. So this was the beginning of the federal government's segregation policies. How could it be that this progressive Democratic administration was so involved in segregation? Some years ago, I forget now, maybe 10 years ago, Ira Katz-Nelson wrote a book called When Affirmative Action Was White. And he explained how policies like Social Security and minimum wage required the support of Southern Democrats who were segregationists in order to get Social Security and the minimum wage passed. The Roosevelt administration had to compromise by excluding from coverage in the Social Security Act and the Minimum Wage Act the occupations in which African Americans predominated. And he was absolutely right about that. But I think people have gotten the wrong impression from Ira Katznelson's analysis and concluded that that was the sole explanation for the segregation policies that the New Deal was following. And I don't think that that's correct. I don't think that applies to the housing policies that we're talking about. Remember that the South, well, the Social Security and the minimum wage laws, those were national laws with a standard that had to be national. You couldn't have different Social Security systems in different parts of the country. So it had to be a single system, and you needed Southern support to get it enacted. Housing is different. We know, for example, that in the South, they had segregated schools. No Southern segregationists ever objected to the North having integrated schools. This was so long as they were permitted to preserve their way of life. I'm talking about white Southern Democrats. They didn't care what the crazy people in the North did. And the same thing would have been true of housing. There was no reason why, and I'm not suggesting that this would have been a good, it still would have been a civil rights violation, but the Public Works Administration or the Federal Housing Administration could have agreed to segregate public housing or suburbanization in the South while not segregating in the North. Nobody would have, no Southerner would have objected to that. You have to understand, I think, that the Roosevelt administration was not only compromising with Southern Democrats. The Democratic Party as a whole was a policy that had little concern at that time for civil rights, for the rights of African Americans. In the book, I tell one story, which I'll repeat now, and that is that in the beginning of the 20th century, we had an integrated civil service in this country. It was small. We didn't have a national government like we have now, but the civil service was integrated. It grew during the Republican presidencies of McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. And then in 1912, Woodrow Wilson, a Southern segregationist, was elected president. He had moved up to New Jersey before he ran for president, but he was from the South and was a segregationist. And the Wilson administration began a policy of segregating the federal civil service, which had not been segregated before. For the first time, curtains were placed in federal office buildings to separate black and white clerical workers. This was in 1913. Black civil servants were fired if they supervised white workers because that was no longer permitted. An African American was not permitted to supervise a white in the federal civil service after 1913. And separate bathroom facilities were set up in the basements of federal office buildings for African American civil servants. This was the policy of the Wilson administration. One of the biggest federal departments at the time was the Navy Department. And the federal official responsible for implementing this policy of segregation in the Navy Department was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, whose name was, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy? Everybody should know this. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1913, Franklin Roosevelt. Now, I am not suggesting in any way that Franklin Roosevelt liked the policy. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, that he supported it, but he didn't object to it. This was the environment in which he matured as a political official. I'll give one other example, and then I'll stop. Roosevelt's closest advisor during the 1930s was a senator from South Carolina, James F. Burns. The press called him Mr. Assistant President. It was well known that he was Roosevelt's closest advisor on all matters. The only civil rights legislation that was considered in the 1930s was an anti-lynching bill. The leader of opposition to the anti-lynching bill was Senator Burns, who got up on the floor of the Senate and explained how lynching was necessary to keep blacks, that's not what he called them on the floor of the Senate, but to keep black men from raping white women. This was what the speech he made on the floor of the Senate. This was Roosevelt's closest advisor. 3 years after Burns made this speech, Roosevelt appointed him to the Supreme Court. He was such a close advisor to Roosevelt that when World War II broke out, Roosevelt pulled him off the Supreme Court to rejoin his cabinet to advise him in helping to run the war. And if he had not been pulled off the Supreme Court during World War II by Roosevelt, by this Roosevelt appointee, we would not have had Brown versus Board of Education in this country. So I think it's a more complicated story than simply a compromise with Southern Democrats. Again, I'm not suggesting that Roosevelt agreed with Burns's racial views, but he was certainly aware of them. He was such a close advisor. My view is that Roosevelt just didn't care. Racial issues were not a high priority for him. His wife was constantly, as you know, importuning him about the policies that his own administration was following. He explained that he needed to keep following them in order to maintain Southern support. But I'm suggesting that that was not the whole story. I do hope to come back sometime here to the Roosevelt Library and look into this much, much more deeply. But thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for inviting me here today.